Hello, my name is Debbie Kennett, and I'm going to be talking to you today about genetic ancestry testing and the end of donor anonymity. DNA testing has been around since the year 2000, but in the early years, there was only a very limited range of tests, and the tests were very expensive. And it was only really in the year 2017 that DNA testing started to take off in a big way, as the cost of the test started to come down and as the companies started to advertise their tests and to market them much more extensively. In 2017, more tests were sold in that year than in all the previous years combined. And we estimate now, midway through 2020, that over 35 million tests have been sold around the world. Now, a DNA test on its own is not actually that informative. The power of DNA testing comes with the ability to compare your DNA with other people in a large database. And there are 5 companies that currently offer DNA databases where you can look for matches with genetic relatives. The largest company is Ancestry DNA. They have a database now of over 16 million people. 23andMe have a database of over 12 million people, although the focus of their test is mainly on health rather than on ancestry. MyHeritage have a database of around about 4 million people. They have specialized in marketing to continental Europe, and they have a website that's available in multiple different European languages. Family Tree DNA have been around since the year 2000 and offer the widest range of tests. They have a database of 2 million people or more. And there's a British company called Living DNA who are a recent startup in this area, specializing in British ancestry. There are 2 components to an ancestry test. The first part of it is that you will get your percentages trying to tell you which parts of your DNA can be traced back to particular countries or regions of the world. Now, these tests are becoming increasingly more accurate, but they are still really only reliable at the broadly continental level. I've tested at all 5 companies, and you can see that the companies all agree that my ancestry is from northwestern Europe, but when it gets down to the country level, the results can vary considerably. So on the left there, 23andMe assign me with 18% of my DNA to France and Germany. MyHeritage at the bottom ascribe 9.2% of my DNA to Italy, even though I have no ancestors from France, Germany, or Italy within the last few hundred years. And the other companies, they also offer different proportions in different countries. Most of my ancestry is actually from the UK and Ireland. But the main purpose of a DNA test, certainly for genealogy purposes and for our purposes today, is the ability to search for matches in the database. And all the companies will allow you to contact your matches. You either contact the matches through the company's own messaging system, or in some cases, you're given the email address of your matches. So how does the matching process work? Well, we each inherit 50% of our DNA from each of our parents, and the DNA that we inherit from our parents is effectively a patchwork of the DNA from all of our ancestors going back for many, many generations. But if you were to compare your DNA with, say, your grandparents, you would expect to inherit, on average, 25% from each of your grandparents, but there is actually quite a wide variation around that average. So it may be you will inherit 19% from your grandmother, but 31% from your grandfather. And then with each generation, the amount of DNA is halved. So you get on average 12.5% from each of your great grandparents, and then so on back through the generations. And if we go back, say 400 years, you will only have DNA from a very small subset of your ancestors. So maybe less than a third of your ancestors from 400 years ago will be represented in your DNA today. So the companies can look at the amount of DNA shared, the number of segments shared, and the size of those segments, and they can make predictions about the relationship. So if 2 people share 50% of their DNA, then that means that that's either a parent-child relationship or a full sibling relationship, and there are ways of distinguishing between the 2. If people share 25% of their DNA, it could be a grandparent-grandchild relationship, aunt, uncle, niece and nephew, half-siblings, or double first cousins, where two brothers marry two sisters. And in these cases, quite often just having the context, so for example, knowing someone's age or where they live can eliminate many of the alternative possibilities. But as we go, as the amount of DNA shared is reduced, then the number of possible relationships starts to increase. And you really always need to have the genealogical information in combination with the genetic information in order to assign the relationships. And once you get out to more distant relations, like say third or fourth cousins, then the amount of DNA shared is not very definitive. So you could be matching someone as, say, a fourth cousin, but equally that same amount of DNA would be shared by someone who is a 10th cousin, and there's no way of distinguishing between those two relationships. So just to show you how the matching process works, this is my match page at Ancestry DNA, and you can see the two different parts of the test, the ethnicity estimate and also the matches. And Ancestry also have a feature called Through Lines, where they also try and work out, using the family trees they have on the website, how you're related to some of your matches. You get a match list showing the people that you are related to, and the companies will try and identify what the relationship is. So here I've tested both of my parents, and that parent-child relationship was correctly assigned. They've identified a second cousin, but you can see the range is possibly second to third cousin, and then there's a third cousin. And in fact, my match page goes on and on and on, and I've got something like 30,000 matches at Ancestry DNA. But it's generally only the matches that are the closer cousins, the fourth cousin and closer, that we tend to focus on. And I've got over 200 of those now. Because of the big increase in the size of the databases, we are now able to solve mysteries that previously would have been impossible to solve. So somebody who is a foundling can now take a DNA test and quite often has a good chance of being able to identify their birth parents. Adoptees can take a DNA test, and if they can't access their adoption records, a DNA test can still provide information about their ancestry. So this Irish pensioner here at the age of 81 took a DNA test and was able to identify her birth mother, who was 103 years old and still alive and living in Scotland. And DNA testing has also been used to try and solve cold cases. And this is not the commercial DNA sites that are used for this, but a third-party website called GEDmatch, where people who have tested at the other companies can upload their DNA specifically for this purpose. But it's the same principle and the same methods used to solve cold cases as it is to work on unknown parentage cases. But the other side of the coin is that DNA can also provide many surprises. And the most common occurrence is that somebody can take a DNA test and they can find out that their father is not their father. People can test and find half-siblings or other close relationships in the database they didn't know existed. And a man can take a DNA test and discover he has a child that he knew nothing about. And we've also had some extraordinary stories come to light where in at least 6 cases now, there have been people who have discovered through DNA testing that they were switched at birth in the hospital and their parents went home with the wrong child. And in this particular case that was 2 ladies at the age of 72 made this surprising discovery. But one of the interesting things is that however shocking or surprising the discovery, people are generally much happier knowing than not knowing. So what are the implications for donor conception? Well, now any donor-conceived individual can take a DNA test in order to search for their biological parent or parents. Someone who is a donor can take a DNA test to try and find their offspring. Recipient parents can test their child to identify the donor and their child's half-siblings. But conversely, donor origins can be unexpectedly revealed through DNA testing. And the donors can have their anonymity breached regardless of what the terms and conditions were when they first signed up to make their donations. Most importantly, the donor does not have to be in the database to be identified. As with the foundling and adoptee cases, the biological parent or parents can be identified through a network of genetic cousins. And if someone has, say, a close match like an aunt or uncle in the database, it then becomes very easy to work out the identity. And the donor-conceived person also does not necessarily need to be in the database to be identified. The secret could potentially come out if the donor-conceived person has a child who takes a DNA test, and the child would make the discovery and would have to tell the parent. So what are the chances of actually identifying your parent through a DNA test? Well, there's a small group called We Are Donor Conceived who have been running surveys for the last few years. In their most recent survey in 2019, they looked at, they had a sample of 312 donor conceived people from 15 different countries, although mostly from the US and Canada. And in this group, 37% of them had actually learned of their donor origins from a commercial DNA test. Most of them were actually born before 1990. And 55% of the people in this group had successfully identified their donor through DNA testing. Now, clearly, this is a group who are motivated to search, but we have certainly seen many cases where people have taken a DNA test and right from the outset, they've been matched with a half sibling or sometimes even a birth parent. There is now a whole range of support groups that have been set up to help people, to help donor-conceived individuals who are searching for their biological parents through DNA. There's a group called DNA for the Donor-Conceived, which provides help on interpreting DNA results. There's another group called DNA Adoption, which has classes that you can sign up to, and they also have free tutorials online explaining the methodology for doing these searches. And at Family Tree DNA, there is even a project for donor-conceived individuals. And for people who get surprise results from DNA tests, and the number is increasing all the time, the companies themselves are now training, in two of the companies at least, are now training their customer service reps to handle these difficult situations. So quite often the first reaction when somebody gets an unexpected result is they think the company's made a mistake and they've got the results muddled up. So they ring the company, and then the reps will talk the customer through the surprise findings and explain how the system works. There's also a whole range of informal support networks that have been set up. Most of these are actually on Facebook. There's a group called DNA NPE Gateway. NPE stands for Not the Parent Expected, or sometimes non-paternity event. And this group will screen people before they join and assign them to the appropriate subgroups. So they have groups for not just individuals who have surprise results, but also for, say, the partners or the children of people who have surprise results. And in the UK, we have a group called the Donor Conception Network, who provides support for all donor families, and they are able to refer people to counsellors in the event that they get unexpected DNA results. And we are seeing in America some people who are now genetic counsellors who are now specialising in offering advice and support when people get unexpected results from DNA tests. And a lady called Brianne Kirkpatrick has been one of the pioneers in this field, and she has set up a practice called Watershed DNA, and she specialises in providing support for unknown parentage cases. Now, what we're seeing is that many of the families that are produced from donor conception are actually very, very large. And more of these half siblings are being connected with each other, but the donors themselves often don't know how many children they have. One donor in the UK was able to identified as a donor, even though he'd not taken a test himself, because his uncle was the family historian and had DNA tested, and he was connected with at least 2 of his children, but he thinks he may have over 100 children out there. There is one in the UK. We have a fertility doctor called Bertold Wiesner, who with his partner Mary Barton founded one of the very early fertility clinics in the 1940s. And we're now finding that in many cases, these fertility doctors actually use their own sperm to inseminate the mothers. And Wiesner is thought to have fathered at least 600 children. And that already there's a group of at least 30 people who are now connected with each other through DNA testing, with more and more being discovered each month. In the Netherlands, there is another doctor who is thought to have fathered at least, perhaps even as many as 1,000 siblings. And one person whose story was told in the Times newspaper here in the UK, when he first took his DNA test, he was matched immediately in the family tree DNA database with 48 half-siblings. So you can imagine the shock of not only just making the discovery that your donor conceived, but also that you have all these half-siblings out there to get to know. And in America, there have been so many of these what is called fertility fraud cases that in some states they have now made fertility fraud a crime, although the crime is not retrospective. So people in some cases can be fined several $1,000s and in some cases even be put in prison for up to 2 years. And now, because so many donor-conceived individuals have made discoveries through DNA testing about their donor origins, the voices of these donor-conceived individuals are increasingly being heard. And in November last year, a group of donor-conceived individuals were invited to talk at the United Nations at an event to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And you can watch all their talks online. It's well worth doing. And they also came up with a set of recommendations for donor conception, which they hope that legislatures, both nationally and internationally, will be able to incorporate into their frameworks. So now, to conclude, in 2020, we can say that DNA effectively means that donors are not anonymous. This, of course, raises all sorts of questions. First of all, about whose responsibility it is to provide the support and counselling for all the parties affected. And there's also a great need to protect and respect the privacy and wishes of all the parties involved and their family members. What we are finding is that people have different approaches to knowing. So some people are happy to tell their friends and family that they are donor conceived. Others still want to maintain that secrecy. And it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain these secrets when you have large family networks. And what are the responsibilities of the fertility sector, and particularly for some of these historic cases which go back 40, 50 years or more, and those clinics are no longer available? These people seem to have fallen through the support network. Is there a need for changes in existing legislation? For example, should the name of the donor be included on a birth certificate? Should we be introducing retrospective legislation, as has happened in the state of Victoria in Australia, where donor-conceived individuals were retrospectively given the right to have the names of their biological father? And is it perhaps time for a new paradigm? There are now some organisations such as Pride Angel which advocate a much more open model of donor conception and systems of co-parenting where the biological father is actually involved right from the outset with the upbringing of the child. So all of these questions we will need to look at in the coming years. I don't have all the answers, but I hope that during the course of this conference we will be able to have discussions about these issues. So thank you very much for listening.